2, 4, 6, 8, 9. Man. Monday. Good morning, everybody. I guess I have been pretty cutting it to the wire myself. Hello. Okay, so first thing I want to talk about today is actually when to have the peer feedback on the drafts of your podcasts, so that your classmates, and so the way it's going to work is everybody's going to be responsible for giving feedback, I guess, on 2. We'll do it that way. And thus everybody will receive feedback from 2 podcasts, 2 or 3. And we had said that we were going to have it do like final draft posted to the blog by this week here is what you guys had indicated, I believe. You wanted the beginning of the second week of April, right? Which is fine by me. That's cool. But I think to give you time to assimilate everybody's comments and do all that, I would like to have the drafts done before spring break. I think that makes sense. So how about you have your you have to have your podcast. I want the feedback done by the Friday before you go on spring break. All right. So I want you to have given feedback on your peers. So for them to be able to do that, you need to have your draft uploaded, I would guess, no later than the Monday the 18th, or I could do Friday the 15th. Which would you guys prefer? You want that weekend? Okay. Sure. That's fine by me. Who agrees with that? Okay. And nobody strongly disagrees. So we'll do that. Monday the 18th, you have to have a draft uploaded. Pardon me. Ooh. You have to have a draft uploaded by the 18th, and then your peers will give some feedback by that Friday. So you will, within the span of that week, have to listen to and provide substantive comments on your peers' podcasts. And the way we're going to do that, we'll use SoundCloud. So you just get yourself a SoundCloud account, free account. You'll be able to upload your audio to SoundCloud, and then I will give you, I'll figure out who your partners are. I'll make a matrix of that, and we'll get the links to that person. Then the person who's doing the reviewing during that week will be able to, you can, I don't know how familiar most of you are with SoundCloud, but you can post comments right in the timeline of the audio on SoundCloud. So I think that'll be useful to people. Like, here, this was really good. This part was a little bit choppy. This part didn't make sense, or transition needed work here, there, etc. That kind of thing. Okay, just with the goal of supportive, constructive criticism, like helping them make their podcast better, more informative, more interesting, etc., etc. Any questions about that? How is everybody? You're not good? Yes, please. The next thing I wanted to say was the podcasts for this week are posted here in the Moodle, and they're also on the class website under resources. And I'm not giving you any student ones from last year. I was considering giving you guys an example of what I thought a poor one was, a not very good one. But I don't want to put that student on the spot too much. I don't know. Do you want an example? Do you want to see an example of one that I thought was not especially strong? All right. Well, I'll see. I'll see if I don't know. I might do that just to give you. You've had some examples of what I thought were pretty good student ones, and I'll see if I can find one that's wasn't really meeting what I thought the mark was. But the other ones are on this theme of last time we had This American Life and what was the other one? There's the Ira Glass one and pardon me, what? Radiolab. Thank you. Those are really mainstream, sort of more narrative style podcasts. This week I'm going, if you haven't picked up on this, if I haven't said it explicitly enough, I'm going to say it explicitly now. One of my major themes that I want to communicate to you is that science communication is critical. All right, it's critical. And particularly as a group of non-scientists, I believe all people, all informed voters, all informed citizens need to have a basic ability to understand popular science, to understand, to incorporate it, understand it, assimilate it, and be able to understand the issues that are facing our world currently. So another way that science information is conveyed to the general non-scientific public is just through the media, the news media, right? And so today, or this week, I found some examples of, on the topic of GMOs, I found a bunch of podcasts that are in the popular media. I have one that's not actually a podcast, it's actually a video. I think that's kind of fun. A little bit different. It is audio, but also visual. From the New York Times, which is kind of interesting because it looks back. It's these. I don't know if any of you have ever watched any of these retro reports from the New York Times, but they look back at archival footage on a topic, how it's been reported in the news throughout the years historically, and then where that topic is today. So it's looking at GMO and the news reporting that's happened around GMO over the years, which is pretty interesting. The New York Times obviously is a more left center newspaper, but in this retro report they do present clips from kind of across, I would say, the center. Left center and right center reporting on GMO from back in the day. And then I have NPR, a couple things from NPR, which is a little bit more straight ahead centrist, maybe a little bit left of center as well. I didn't take the time to find any right of center reporting on GMOs, but I kind of felt like this was enough for now. If you have anything of interest that's from maybe the right or right of center that is not that is fact based, I would be interested in seeing it. But anyways, there are those three. There are those three podcasts for you to listen to. They're all really short, right? Altogether, it's less than 20 minutes, so that should be a pretty easy listen to for you guys. All right. I I think that is that. Any questions on anything from last time? I'm going to try to give you guys some sort of a quiz, maybe this week, maybe Friday, and probably over the podcasts, just to make sure that you're listening to them. Okay, so please do take the time to listen to them. It's pretty minor amount of work. Okay. So I left us last time at talking about photosynthesis and the process whereby plants or the autotrophs are using the energy of the sun and storing that radiant energy as chemical energy in the bonds that get formed between carbon atoms, and that makes up sugars, right? So cellulose, for example, is the polymer of glucose that is responsible for wood. And it's made up of carbon dioxide. It's composed of carbon dioxide and water. So what a plant does is absorbs the light of the sun, combines carbon dioxide, water, and gives off oxygen and carbohydrates. So essentially what this is called reducing carbon dioxide to a sugar. So a carbon dioxide is a highly oxidized form of carbon. And the whole idea of oxidization is related to how many bonds something has to oxygen is one way of thinking it, a sort of simple way of thinking about oxidization. All right, so then all of this, these carbohydrates that get produced by the process of photosynthesis, this forms the very bottom of the food chain, right? So all life on Earth and everything that moves and grows and is alive, the energy of that is just converted energy of the sun that has been stored as chemical energy, and then biology has evolved to be able to utilize this energy. So that's all pretty straightforward, probably middle school chemistry, I'm guessing. This magic happens by virtue of this molecule called chlorophyll. And there's a number of different varieties of chlorophyll. You see a picture of it on the left there. It's this sort of trampoline structure, a molecular trampoline structure with a magnesium ion stuck right in the middle. And you'll notice when you look at that structure, it's got all these double bonds. And not just double bonds, but what are called conjugated double bonds. A conjugated double bond system is one in which you have a double bond next to a single bond, next to another double bond, next to a single bond, next to a double bond. And when you have that kind of conjugated system, we're going to see it again when we look at unsaturated fats. We'll see conjugated double bond systems in fats. But when you see it in any of these molecular systems, though the electrons that make up those double bonds are in a slightly different configuration than a standard chain of single bonds. And because they're in a different configuration, they are able to absorb light very readily. They are able to absorb light, go to an excited state, and then release that energy again, which is what gives them the chlorophyll, the characteristic color that we see. So that is to say, chlorophyll A absorbs light in the ultraviolet and the violet and blue range, and also absorbs it in the orange and red range, but it does not absorb light in the green part of the spectrum. And because of that, that green light, which is not being absorbed, just gets reflected because it doesn't need light of that color. And which is why when we look at a leaf, it looks green. Okay? Does that make sense? It's just all the other light is being absorbed. So on the right-hand side, you're going to see all these different color traces here, right, across the light spectrum. And we have chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B. These are the active molecules in different types of plants, which are going to have slightly different color profiles to the naked eye. But then we see another one, this other molecule here called the carotenoids. And the carotenoids are a class of molecules that we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into vitamins and what vitamins and minerals are. We'll talk just briefly about the carotenoids. But they are, so beta-carotene, for example, is one of them that you can see in carrots. It is present in carrots. It's why carrots have the characteristic color they have, the orange color. It's because they absorb light in the blue end of the spectrum, but not so much in the red and orange end of the spectrum. And that's the light that gets reflected, and that's why we see carrots as the color that they are. All right. So there's a host of different colors that are found in plants and vegetables that we may, fruits and vegetables that we may eat. And those colors are indicative of the different, what are called chromophores. So these are molecules that absorb light and do any number of biological services for the plant. So for example, phycocyanin is another one of these chromophores that you see there. And it absorbs light on the red end of the spectrum. Thus, plants that have it appear blue or purple. And this is the kind of thing you would see like in a blueberry, for example. We're going to leave it at that. We're not going to unpack it that much, but that's the origin of color in plants. All right. So here is a little bit closer look at actually what's happening in photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, the whole process of reducing carbon dioxide to a carbohydrate or a sugar, that whole process can be, and then releasing oxygen, that can be divided into a light reaction and a dark reaction. It's the light reaction that is actually converting solar energy into chemical energy. The plant requires light to be able to make these high energy molecules, ATP, and then the reducing equivalent NADPH. But on the other side, there's these dark reactions, and that go in a cycle. This is called the Calvin cycle, after the guy that discovered it. And the Calvin cycle requires energy. It requires energy to do this and to make the carbohydrate. And that energy comes from the ATP in the light reaction. So in the daytime, the plant is building up its store of ATP. It's and concurrently driving the Calvin cycle. The dark reaction can happen at night. The plant can still grow, so to speak, or make carbohydrates, as long as it has ATP that it's willing to spend on that process, ATP that has been stored up during the day. The NADPH and the NAD plus, these are what are called reducing equivalents. So NADPH is the H on there is just a reducing equivalent, which means that NADPH can get oxidized and can give up its hydrogen. We're not going to get into the details of that chemistry, but it's really the molecule that's doing the work, so to speak, if you want to think of it that way. It's not providing the energy, that's ATP, but it's the one that's actually sort of carrying the water, if you want to think of it that way. All right. The kinds of plants that you can eat can get divided into two categories. There are actually three categories. There's C3, C4, and CAM. CAM we won't talk about because CAM is mostly like cactuses and stuff like that. But C3 plants are, so the difference between C3 and C4 plants is they have slightly different compartments. The way the cells are put together have slightly different compartmentalization of these different reactions, and that have implications in terms of water conservation. It's all about water conservation. And knowing that, it's probably not going to come as a massive surprise that C3 plants tend to be more temperate, like here in Maine. So C3 plants tend to be native to Maine. And then C4 plants are ones that are able to conserve water a little bit better because of the compartmentalization in their cellular structure that enables them to conserve water. So, for example, corn is the classic example of a C4 plant. And I'm talking about this because there's something kind of interesting about this. So we've talked about isotopes, going back to the first lecture in class. Remember that? Isotopes. What is an isotope? Anybody? Yeah, Josh.
It's a particle that has neutrons.
Thank you. Yep. So isotopes are two atoms of the same element, meaning the same number of protons. Carbon, for example. Two atoms of carbon are going to both act like carbon, but if they're different isotopes, one is going to have, say, 6 neutrons and the other may have 7. So you can have carbon-12 or carbon-13. Those would be two different isotopes of carbon. The thing that's interesting here is that C3 plant, because when you have a chemical reaction, it's easy to just see the letters bumping into each other and forming bonds and what have you, right? But reactions happen. They need energy to happen. And they happen because a molecule bumps into one another with a certain amount of force. So you can imagine, I find creating analogies to romantic situations to be kind of instructive. So imagine your soulmate, whatever that means, this person who is your perfect partner, right? You are really can have the potential to form a super strong bond with this person. How do we get that bond to form? What if what if you guys live in suites across the hall from each other in the dorm? You bump into each other a lot. What if you have a common friend? You're going to bump into each other quite a bit, and it's going to be pretty easy to form that bond, right? However, what if that person doesn't live in your dorm? And in fact, they don't even go to Colby. Maybe they go to Bowdoin. They're at Bowdoin. You may run into them at a a football game or a hockey game or something like that. Chances are much lower that you're going to form that potential bond. What if you are in New York City and the two of you get on the same subway? Very light interaction, right? There's not a lot of energy to that collision. So one of the things that dictates the kinetics, meaning how fast a reaction is going to happen, is the mass of an atom. And you can, in this analogy, you can think of it as circumstantial. It's like a circumstantial analogy. Like, you guys have a common friend and live in the same dorm versus, being complete strangers. C4 plants, so any reaction is going to be affected by the isotopic identity of the atoms that are in the molecule that's going to be engaging in that reaction. All right. So, for example, say we're trying to bond carbon dioxide to another atom of carbon dioxide and make some sugar. That reaction may be favored if those atoms are both carbon-13 in the CO2 versus carbon-12 in them, because they have a little bit more mass, right? So when they're flying at each other at the same temperature, it's like having a baseball flying at the same speed as a bowling ball flying at the same speed. The bowling ball is going to pack a bigger wallop. Even though they're moving at the same speed, the bowling ball has more force behind it. And it's the same thing, like these atoms that are moving around at a certain temperature, they're all at the same temperature, but if it has a little more mass, there's more energy to it when they collide. So C4 plants, because of they have slightly different reactions or reaction compartments for binding this carbon dioxide, they preferentially take up carbon-13. So that means if you were to look at a piece of corn versus a piece of wheat, which is C3, corn is C4, if you compared the isotopic distribution of carbon-12 to carbon-13 in corn versus wheat, there would be more carbon-13 in the corn than there would be in the wheat. You guys following this? Sort of? Who's lost? No one? Really? You're a little lost. Okay. You understand the idea of isotope, carbon-12 and carbon-13? Carbon-13 is a little heavier. And because of the specifics of the reactions, which we're not going to get into, in C4 plants, the carbohydrates that are made in the corn are going to have more C13 in them. That corn is going to pull carbon dioxide that's made of carbon-13 out of the atmosphere more willingly than it will pull carbon-12 compared to a C3 plant. Does that make sense? That's really the point that I'm making. That's all. This is interesting. This is interesting because I told you earlier, for example, when we were talking about nitrogen, that 3/4 of the nitrogen in your body, which is a pretty good chunk of who you are, is nitrogen that got pulled out of the atmosphere in some reaction vessel doing the Haber-Bosch process. You are what you eat. So the carbon that is in you, comes from the plant that originally pulled it out of the atmosphere. Okay? And this is how, if I were to take, and I would like to later in this semester, take little snips of all of your hair, just a little bit, like super teeny tiny amount of hair, and you can send that hair through a mass spectrometer and look at the isotopic distribution of carbon-12 to carbon-13 in your hair, and you can tell how much corn is in a person's diet. You're like, gee, I don't eat corn. I don't eat corn ever. if you eat meat, if you eat any kind of meat that was grown in the United States, you eat lots of corn, right? Because that's nothing but corn. That's corn that went its way up the food chain, right? Because most of American beef is corn-fed. If you live in Europe and you ate a similar diet of beef, but that was grown in Europe, Europe has grass-fed beef, right? And so that grass is C3. So the C13 profile is going to be completely different. If a person's a vegetarian, if they're a vegetarian, you can tell that from the isotopic distribution in their hair. And it all goes back to the difference between a C3 and a C4 plant. I know it's confusing because I'm like C3, C4, carbon 13, carbon 12, a lot of C's swimming around in the sea, in the oceans of your mind. C3 and C4 are just labels that they give to these two types of plants. C3 are temperate, C4 are more tropical or equatorial plants. Is everybody cool with that so far? No? Would you tell me? Yes.
Does it matter?
The amount of carbon 13, that difference between carbon 13 versus carbon 12 in a person who eats a lot of C4 based, has a C4 based diet versus a C3 based diet is so small, it's so small that it has no biological significance. It really has no biological significance. But it is interesting for diagnostic purposes. You can tell what a person's diet is just by looking at the isotopes of carbon and nitrogen in their hair, in a tiny little piece of their hair, or from skin flakes, right? You could take like a few pieces of skin flakes from a person and be able to back out what their diet is, what they've been eating. I don't know if anyone's watched that movie, Gattaca, right? You can tell a lot more than just a person's genome from little bits of them. You can tell a lot about a person if you know what you're looking at. Any other questions? It was a good question. On the other hand, I will say this: if you were to eat like nothing but C13 containing food, where you were all C13, I don't know. It'd be super expensive. It'd be like blow your mind expensive to eat nothing but C13 labeled sugars. And maybe it would have an effect. It does have an effect if we talked about heavy water versus regular water at the beginning of the semester, didn't we? Yeah. But hydrogen, the difference in mass between a proton and a deuteron, which is just a proton and a neutron, it's like 100% heavier, right? Whereas C13 is like 6% or something like that heavier than a carbon 12. Does that make sense? Right. All right. So I am going to talk about the carbon cycle. You're wait, this is not environmental studies. Can we just get to the fat, the skinny on fat here or whatever? It is important. The carbon cycle is important because this is sort of the chemistry behind food production. And contrary to what that guy, that new physicist who's on the, whatever, we won't go there. But the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is changing. That is unequivocal. And it does have consequences in terms of how food is made and what happens to the food that is being grown in our atmosphere. Hopefully this will come as something interesting to you. So carbon cycle has a slow and a fast time scale, just like phosphorus. Unlike phosphorus, there's the gaseous form, right? Phosphorus was unique in that there was no gaseous form of phosphorus. So the slow carbon time scale is about anywhere from 1,000 to 1,000,000 years. This is carbon that's moving, fossilized carbon that's moving through the rocks. And there is a fast carbon cycle that's essentially moving through the biosphere, right? So a tree takes up the carbon, dies, and then it gets liberated as carbon dioxide. So that's the fast one. And that can just happen within the span of years to decades, however long it takes for something to break down. All right. If you look at this carbon cycle, so there's the oceanic cycle, which is super important. It's a major contributor. Algae takes part in that, and the respiration, the photosynthesis and respiration of algae in the ocean. Plants are basically fixing carbon dioxide, bringing it down out of the atmosphere, and then a bunch of things are liberating it. And most of them are human mediated. So humans and animals breathe. That's cool. We need to breathe. And that's not seriously disrupting the carbon cycle. However, deforestation, when you deforest something, you burn wood or whatever, that's liberating all of that carbon that was sunk into the forest. It's putting it back in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Plants do actually respire. They don't just photosynthesize. They respire as well. So they do give off carbon dioxide as well as take it up, although they don't do them at the same rate. And then the big thing is burning fossil fuels, right? So pumping carbon that has been sequestered over the eons in oil and gas, basically the fossilized carbon and coal and all that stuff. When you burn that, that chucks an enormous amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So normally the planet is at a steady state or a very slowly shifting equilibrium with time, incredibly slowly shifting equilibrium. But we've really thrown off this slow sea cycle by taking carbon that's in the sedimentary rock in the bottom of that kind of complicated flow diagram on the left. And we're just pumping a huge, gigatons, if you can wrap your head around what a freaking gigaton is. We're throwing gigatons of carbon dioxide every year up into the atmosphere. And so then you look at the CO2 levels over the past 10,000 years. Some of the early traces are derived from ice cores. They'll take ice cores and look at super teeny tiny ice bubbles of air in the ice core, and they can tell what the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere back then was. And it has skyrocketed over the last 100 years since the Industrial Revolution. So I'm going to get to the consequence of this in a minute, and if I haven't already made this abundantly clear, this is due to the fossil fuels that have been liberated, and the carbon dioxide that's been liberated by the burning of fossil fuels. This amount of carbon dioxide is far in excess of the carbon dioxide that's being fixed back into the earth via forests, crops, and other forms of carbon fixation. All right. So here's the point that I'm going to start getting at, and this is going to be we can debate this for a moment. So as atmospheric carbon dioxide increases, plants photosynthesize more rapidly. If you're driving your car, if you step on the gas, the car goes faster, right? Carbon dioxide's the fuel that kind of drives photosynthesis, sort of, right? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Okay, so not considering the effect of carbon dioxide on climate change. We're not going to worry about that. We're going to pretend like that doesn't exist, which seems like we're not alone in that perspective. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? If plants photosynthesize more rapidly with a higher level of carbon dioxide? Yeah, Josh.
Was CO2 ever this though? I guess they were CO2.
Well, probably long ago. But no, it's not. It's not limiting. But this is the relationship. As carbon dioxide, partial pressure of carbon dioxide goes up, it's able to photosynthesize more rapidly. So access to light is, can be a limiting factor. Yes, sir. They need a baseline of nitrogen and phosphorus to have proteins, and you're getting at something important here. But no, they don't. Nitrogen and phosphorus are not. It's a good question. It's a complicated answer because ATP and a bunch of proteins that ATP requires phosphate and a bunch of proteins require nitrogen. But I would say that carbon dioxide is probably the limiting factor here because the machinery that the plant has for making carbohydrates from carbon dioxide is not fully saturated. So it's not like operating at peak capacity. And so as you increase the level of carbon dioxide, you move towards saturating that machinery and you can produce it faster. What do you think? So I'm showing you lines for C3 and C4 plants there. And we're at the steep part of the curve, aren't we? We're at the steep part of the curve. So as carbon dioxide goes up, we are able to make carbohydrates ever faster. More wood, more starch, more carbohydrates. You're all obviously being reticent to answer because I'm like trying to fool you here, right? Seems like it would be a good thing, doesn't it? But it's clearly not, actually. So the problem is he was touching on it a little bit, right? So we were thinking about, and this is like bringing all of this whole unit together, where I was talking about the elements that make up a person or a plant or a food or anything. As you incorporate more carbon, you're not necessarily incorporating all of the other elements more rapidly as well. All right? And so what happens is you shift the ionome or the elemental distribution in a plant, and in fact, you make plants less nutritious. You make plants less nutritious. So here is an example of this. This guy here, Irakli Laladze. I don't know how to say his last name. But he did a lot of work looking at the elemental distribution in plants with time and grown at higher carbon dioxide levels. And he discovered that with time, with an increase in carbon dioxide, it's actually making our food less nutritious. It's growing faster, but it's depleting minerals at the very base of the human nutritional food chain. What do you think about that? Okay, it's a global phenomenon. This is looking at all kinds of different plants all over the world, and we're seeing a reduced change in mean concentrations of various nutrients all across the board. because of the increase in carbon dioxide. So here's some more. This was actually published in Nature in 2014, so 5 years ago. This is not at the fringes. You don't hear about this, do you? I guess this is not really something that makes its way into mainstream media. But our food, the food you are eating, is in a very real way less nutritive than the food your grandparents were eating. The same tomato, the same spinach. Say you saved the seeds, you're growing it in the same plot of land, you've had your family farm forever. The vegetables you're growing that we're eating now have a lower mineral content because of the increase in the carbon dioxide levels is overdriving photosynthesis in the crop plants that we have. So this is looking at zinc, iron, overall protein, which is a proxy for nitrogen fixation, and phytate, which is it's like other phytochemicals. And if you look at across these four indices of nutrition in wheat, rice, field peas, soybeans, maize, which is corn, and sorghum, all staple crops across broad categories of plants. We have C3 grasses, like wheat and rice, C3 legumes, like meaning beans, soybeans, field peas, and then the C4 grasses like corn and sorghum, which is a source of our sugar. For almost all of those plants, there is a reduction in the nutritive content of those plants, and in some instances quite dramatic, particularly in terms of the heavy metals, the zinc and the iron that's being incorporated into these plants. This has real health implications, real consequences. So this raises the question of protein deficiency, global protein deficiency based on 2050 population projections. So in panel A, this is the current percentage of the global population that's at risk of just basic protein deficiency. They're not able to get enough protein because the ionome has shifted, but currently it's mostly in sub-Saharan Africa because of other sociological issues and developmental issues with that continent. So under an elevated carbon dioxide that is projected to be reached by the year 2050, you can see in the bottom panel, the second panel is the percent of the population that is now newly at risk, not that was at risk before, right? So all those hot spots in the above panel have been normalized and gone back to green. Newly at-risk countries, subcontinent of India is at risk, but China is so enormous that there are millions, over 5 million people. There are over 5 million people that will be at risk of protein deficiency by 2050 just because of the elevated carbon dioxide levels on Earth. 5 million people is a lot. That's a lot of people to be malnourished just because the plants are less nutritive. All right, that's my spiel.